Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Policy Panchayat, where we chat with policy professionals from across the field on their experiences and journeys of building a career in the policy space. I'm Pramiti.
And I'm Michelle. Pramiti and I both help run PPI with the rest of our very small team. And today we're joined by the directors and founders of Women in Econ and Policy.
So, Women in Econ and Policy is a not-for-profit organization set up in June 2020 with the aim of creating a free and inclusive space for women interested in econ, policy, and development to learn and grow together. Could I please request Prerna, Haita, Riya to tell us a little bit about themselves before we get started?
I could go first. Hi, I'm Prerna. I'm currently a PhD student in economics at the University of British Columbia. Prior to joining UBC, I worked at JPAL for a few years, and then I did my master's in economics before that. And I co-founded Women in Econ in June of 2020, along with Prashansa, who was my colleague at JPAL at the time.
Great. I can go next. My name is Inahita, and I'm a prospective PhD candidate in economics at the University of British Columbia. Like Prerna, I also worked moving to Vancouver to do my PhD. I worked on projects at the intersection of mental health and economic well-being. My research interests are broadly in the space of development, gender, labor, and social norms. And I have a master's degree in economics from Ashoka University.
Yeah. My name is Riya. I'm currently working as a senior research associate at Imago Global Grassroots. My research interests lie at the intersection of gender, labor, and econ. Previously, I worked at JPAL South Asia and IFMR lead. Right now, I'm also exploring research in mechanism design, which is basically applied game theory. And I did my undergrad from Tata Institute of Social Sciences and a master's from Azim Premji University.
So, I mean, it's honestly so nice to be like having a conversation with such inspiring women who have not only built impressive careers for themselves, but also continue to work towards, helping other women get there. And I think one of my first few questions, and I mean, even before we get to the questions, right? Do you think you could tell our audience a little bit about, what exactly it is that you aim to do with the platform? And if there was a motivation behind getting here, how far do you think you've come along?
I could talk a little about, I guess, the motivation of setting up the organization, and then Rian and I can talk a little about where we want to go. So when we were setting up the organization, actually, the idea was really simple. It was just to create a space where women who are working in the fields of economics and policy are working to come together, discuss their experiences, learn from each other, and create like a support system of sorts. So the motivation was simply driven because we'd been in the field for a few years, no space like this existed, and we were just thinking about how helpful it would have been for us to have a space like this when we were starting out. So we started with that motivation, and I think our plans for the future and just how ambitious we are has evolved over time as we've seen the response that we got, and we've seen the response that our community has shown, what we felt they need now, and that's affected in a large part our future plans and what we want to do going forward.
Yeah, I think I had joined shortly after Prerna and Prashansa had set up Women in Econ, and we were starting to get a lot of traction on all our activities, and that was also the time we wanted to diversify our engagement. So by that time, there was a newsletter, there was a reading group which didn't take off, but it was still a great effort. And that was also the time we were thinking that, maybe working on a flagship program and diversifying. We got a lot of ideas, like, for instance, maybe podcast. And I think we also started working and putting a lot of structure to our organization, which is typically a very challenging thing because none of us expected that we'll get so much engagement. And I remember Prerna was also looking for someone who can help distribute some workload, and I had said that I'd be happy to help. And we were having these initial conversations, and Prerna said that, like having 3 people would be better. And that's the time I suggested Anahita, because by that time Anahita was managing events. So, like it was a snowball effect, and that's how we started. So I think it's very important to know how we internally structured, because that tells a lot about how we started proceeding and working on some of the activities that we put out. So we also have this events where we do a bunch of things, like we call, I think Anahita can expand more on that, but typically we call speakers. And it's it's also a great way for young researchers to know the inside story for like, because sometimes it's very daunting to see that, there's a university professor, for instance. We invited Seema Jayachandran, we invited Pascaline Dupa, and it was also a journey for us to know some of the challenges. So for instance, I even remember Ruth mentioning that it's completely fine to be a feminist, but at the same time planning your life around your partner, which is sometimes a battle, because you're like, I'm uber feminist, but should I prioritize these things or not? So I think those were some of the activities that we worked on. Anahita?
Sure. So I think, like Ria said, and Prerna said, it's been a very organic journey from where it began to where we are now. I mean, so when Prerna and Prashansa thought of this platform, I think so many women signed up. And I think that was our first sign that, this was something that really women want. Women in the space do feel like it's great to have other women to lean on and just really look at for inspiration, advice, all sorts of things. But then over the last 2 years, I think to me, what we've done is we've, like Ria was saying, tried a bunch of different things. And through this process, it's been very member driven. It's been very like, what can we do that our members find most useful? But the stage we're at now, we're also trying to take a bit of a step back and put a little bit of structure to it, kind of view it in a more of a problem framework. So, what is the problem that we're really trying to address here? Where do we fit in the bigger ecosystem? And there, I think there are a couple of things that we've had kind of conversations on, and we'll continue having conversations on. But that's primarily that, okay, what we kind of know from both research and our own experiences being women in the field is that women face a kind of a pathway and a pipeline problem when it comes to making careers in economics. Women are not drawn to careers in economics in the first place. It's not a very popular major among women. And then once they join, they drop off at different stages. And that kind of leads to this underrepresentation at the job level, whether it's corporate, government, academia, across the board. So we kind of know that this is what's happening. And so our efforts are kind of at this point driven towards addressing the problem from different angles. One is, like Ria was saying, using mentorship and other avenues to bring more women into the field, providing the information and opportunities that women might need to enter the field. Once they are in the field, kind of helping with skills and other events, providing inspiration, facilitating engagement with each other that can help them stay in the field. And then, of course, the last thing that we're trying to focus on, which the events team kind of does to a certain extent, the newsletter team does as well, is spotlight women's work, really make sure we're paying attention to all the amazing, cool stuff that women are doing and continue to do. And so I think as an organization, it's been a journey over the last 2 years. We completed 2 years, 10 days ago. So the first 2 years have been a lot of experimentation and fun and just energy. And I think for the next 2 years, we're looking at just taking all of that, putting a bit of structure to it and charting a very ambitious way forward, I think.
Thank you, guys. I think that was like an extremely well-structured answer. And like also as people who have, been working with a new organization that's also about to hit 2 years, I think we all sort of have like a very similar, trajectory. So like just going off of that, because Ria mentioned like some things take off and some things don't. What has been your experience with, bringing forward this service? That is where a lot of people might think this is extremely niche, it's very small. Like, is there a high demand for this, or is it a niche? And what has been your learning from that? And like also, I think Anahita mentioned the mentorship program, like where you talk about, mentoring women from underrepresented backgrounds, but also apart from that, there's women mid academic career who might require that kind of support. So has your focus changed? Are you thinking about, maybe specializing more in a particular space that this requires more of our attention? So we'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, I think our focus has never changed. The focus has evolved, I would say, just like the organization. And mostly whenever we speak to our board of advisors, they do reiterate that there's a specific space that you could capture, and you can also be resource providers. So, for instance, our focus is to provide free access to resources and mentorship, right? And coming back to your question on what things take off and don't take off. Uh, Anahita mentioned that it's extremely member driven, but at the same time, you need to understand, even if it's member driven, who is actually consuming that content. For instance, we launched our podcast, and it takes a lot of effort to have a podcast, right? From reaching out to university professors, figuring out a host, editing. And because we're doing literally everything in house, it's a different trajectory altogether. And successfully, it could take off. But when it comes to reading group, for instance, reading group does not work in a way podcast does. Podcast, you can just listen to it. But for reading group, if there are 20 people, at least 20 people need to be on some level, same level, right? Like, and that's a little challenging because a lot of our members right now, they are like us, like they're research associates or they're similar age group. We do have a very varied membership. Like, I'm not saying that we don't have university professors as our they are not part of our member base. Of course, undergrad students are also part of our member base, but typically most people who are very engaged with us are of our age group. So demanding reading books, reading articles on a very regular basis, it almost looks like you are recreating a university setup unless you come up with something more creative. Second was the flagship program that I spoke about, the Young Women in Econ program. I think whenever you're launching anything, any new product, for instance, you need to be mindful about how is it that it's going to be perceived. What does the organization capacity? Does the organization have capacity to, for instance, provide support to this? So I remember we were doing a pilot on this. It was a dry run. We wanted to know, okay, fine, like we run evaluations for these uber cool organizations, including JPAL, World Bank, but do we have it in us to be able to do it in a smaller scale? And quite honestly, it's a very tangible thing that you do through this program. You want to reach out to young girls who maybe, firstly, you have to acknowledge your own privilege. Everything starts from there. I come from a family where my grandmother did a PhD, my mother has a double master's. I'm almost playing catch up all my life. It's not that I'm doing something new, but that's not the case everywhere. So you have to understand that you come from a privileged background and you're providing this platform. So when we started to do our pilot with Punjab University students and students from St. Anthony's College in Shillong, we did see that, we needed to break everything to basics. You have to go back to basics in the sense that you have to help them build CVs. You have to provide them with words that can be used in CV. That's not very intuitive, right? Like, these are things that you pick up in university. So I think that was quite a journey to understand how much we know and how much we can provide. Right now, we're doing our Young Women in Econ program 2.0, and there have been a lot of learnings. Not only that, it's a very exhausting process because you have to match students to mentors. You have to come up with curriculums, and the way we wanted to organize it right now is it needs to be quite interactive, so for instance, a lot of things that you learn through this program, these are soft skills like speaking up, confidence, uh, thinking that I'm valuable enough and what I say is not going to be laughed upon, right? These are not things that I can immediately put a pin and say that this is what it looks like. So it's a journey that we make with all these students, and it's a tough one, but I think we're learning, and it's a semi some things that we learned, some things which didn't go well, and I would say the only thing that didn't work out is the reading group, but rest every idea which was member driven, it has solidified in some shape or form.
Yeah, I think like we've had the privilege of a really, really strong and committed organizing committee, because usually you start off as an organization and you do one thing. You do a newsletter, you do a podcast, or you do events, or you do a mentorship program. And we've been able to, from the very start, do all of those things, mainly because we're supported by a lot of women who put in purely voluntary time to make these things happen. And I think that's allowed us to try to target the various stages of the problem that Anahita talked about at the start. And at the end of the day, the underrepresentation of women is such a complex issue in the field that even now, I don't think we do enough, right? Like one of the big problems that we haven't been able to figure out the solution for is that even after you provide mentorship to women, say from like non-elite universities or various diverse backgrounds, it doesn't guarantee that firms will actually hire them. And that's not something that we can solve from the supply side yet. So I think we've tried to identify the different types of problems that exist. We've tried to learn from our experiences. We didn't have the Young Women in Econ program in our first year of existence. We ran the community for the first year. We realized that we were fairly privileged. The organizing committee, our membership pool, we thought about ways to increase access. When we thought about that, we realized that what we do as a community won't cut it. You need to provide access to mentorship, more resources, and so on. So I think like we've tried to understand the problem as best as we can, like think about solutions for different aspects of it, but there's still like a long way to go in terms of actually addressing the problems of women in the field.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think I have a lot to add other than the fact that I feel like both Prerna and Ria mentioned, as an organization for the past 2 years, we've thrived on just an abundance of energy. We still have members email us saying, hey, this would be a cool thing to try out. And most of the times our response is, yes, let's give it a go. So, there are things, again, like we've tried and that have not worked, reading circles, I can name, and they've not worked for various reasons. Like sometimes the member response isn't there. Sometimes it's too much logistical, like it's a logistical nightmare for us. And so we're thinking of how it will scale and so on. But I think from the beginning, the approach has very much been that if we sense a need or if somebody brings up an idea, you can try it out, you can pilot it, you can kind of do it on a smaller scale and then take it as it goes. And we've reached, so kind of like has been discussed before, we've identified a couple of activities that we know now are here to stay. And we really want to focus on doing our best at them, but we're never kind of closed off to other things. And so, for example, and you brought up like whether there's a niche we identify for ourselves. I also feel like we've just really we're not, I think, hyper focused on defining, giving ourselves a concrete definition. We're very much like a member-led community that wants to just provide what people will find useful and helpful in advancing their careers. And so there are, of course, things that we still look forward to, like, building partnerships with other people doing great work, such as yourselves, so that we can contribute to the policy conversations, we can contribute to the creation of public goods, maybe create more concrete professional opportunities for our members. There are, there's an abundance of ideas, a shortage of time, but always the willingness to kind of try things out and figure out what people like. And in the process, if we discover who we are, I think that's great.
I mean, it's so interesting to hear about all the work that's going into the platform and the sort of insights you've derived. I think there's a lot to take from this conversation. But I think a bigger question that will stay with most people joining this call, how can the larger academic and policy community in India make this space more accessible for women? Like, where do you think are the areas for any action to take place to sensitize people? Like, things you've mentioned in your conversations about where the gaps are. So where do you see the community stepping in and kind of helping women out?
Okay, I can talk about it a little, I guess. I think like there is a limit to what we can do as a community or like any organization outside of the infrastructure can do, because so many of the things that make it a space that's not so great for women are actually institutional. And while we can get the conversation started on a lot of those issues, it really comes down to the two institutions making those active changes, right? So like as Anahita mentioned at the start, a lot of women don't choose economics as a major when they're doing their undergraduate degrees. And a lot has to do with how it is perceived. It is labeled as being extremely quantitative and hard. It's labeled as something that more men tend to do than women. So we can't go ahead and solve that problem. A lot of, so when you get to the tenure stage, right? Paid maternal leave, extensions on the tenure clock, making a conscious effort as a department to hire more women. These are all things that I think we've come a long way, and like starting the conversation at different levels has led to institutions making these changes, but there is a limit to what we can do. But what we have tried through the newsletter, through the podcast, is highlighting the work of women who already exist in the field, trying to sort of make it a point to, for example, we only do events with female speakers. When we had a podcast coming out, initially we were actually having a discussion with a different organization about the podcast. And at some point in the middle, we said, oh, we're only going to invite women. And they said, can we invite men too? And we said, no, we can't. There are enough podcasts for men, you know? So I think that's the thing. We need more organizations to make the change. If we're offering someone, say, mentorship, we also need companies who will step in and say, we would be willing to hire beyond, you know, something like a Delhi university. So I think we're trying as a community and we're trying to start a conversation. But one of the things we need to do a little bit more of is increase our own outreach. We're still fairly restricted to metropolitan cities. I don't think like a woman doing an economics degree in a state university in India has heard of women in econ and policy, right? So we need to start extending our own outreach, improving the diversity of our membership pool, improving the diversity of our leadership team, so that we can, I guess, like do better and make the space like more inclusive in the long run, and our own organization, honestly.
I agree. And I think one couple of quick things I want to add. So like Prerna mentioned, a lot of the problems are institutional, right? And so kind of member driven, fairly at this point, still, if you look at it from the institutional point of view, small communities like us can only do so much. But I do think that there's some evidence that basically shows that other women, just bringing more women into the field by itself can be a great factor that pushes kind of, you know, that improves things along the run down the line. Sorry. But so there, I think, for example, like we know that, you know, MBA graduates are more likely to be hired by firms that have women leadership themselves. Women MBA graduates are more likely to be hired by firms that have women graduates at the helm. We know that there's these kind of unofficial schmoozing effects in corporates, at least, where, you know, the people you go on coffee break with or lunch break with, that affects how your professional performance in the firm. I just think even just seeing women occupy spaces that you don't think women belong in, that itself can have an effect on your aspirations and what you believe is feasible for. So there, I think organizations like ours are trying a bit and just trying to increase just sheer number of women there, and then hopefully tick off a reaction where these women just help other women and bring them into the field. Because I think at the institutional level, of course, these are very big problems and with probably very big intractable solutions. And we're trying our best to do kind of the small lever changes that could potentially help bring more women into the field. And I think as a result, hopefully the field will become more humane and just kinder to women and everybody in general. I also think one other quick thing is that there's like, I like to take a bit of an ecosystem view on it. And so, you know, gender is one aspect of people's identity, but then there are other intersectional aspects of people's identity. And there are so many great organizations doing work on other aspects of people's identity and just making economics and policy as a profession more welcoming to people of kind of different identities. I think as an organization, we have a role to play just collaborating and speaking more to these organizations that are doing similar work, so that we can work with, like Prerna was saying, women whose identity sits somewhere at the intersection. So, you know, being a woman, but also being from a non-tier 1 city, also having gone to a non-elite academic institution, these things kind of interact to create a unique set of problems. And so I think for that, us talking to others, doing similar and different work in the field and trying to kind of take that conversation forward might be helpful as well.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add because honestly, both of them covered most of it. But yeah, I think institutional change it's an intergenerational struggle. It's not going to happen just because there's an organization which wants to focus or fill this gap. I also want to like highlight how some other organizations are working. So, for instance, Anahita mentions schmoozing, and that's something that happens, and that has really strong ramifications on how people are hired in organizations. So, there's an organization called LEAP Club, and what they do is they sort of do these social interactions, and women have actually been hired. So, for instance, one of the big four high level manager hired someone within the organization. So I think there's some organizations who are doing or trying to bridge the gap. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, yeah, I mean, it's a long shot and you can only do so much. But at some point we'd also want to move in the direction where we not train but provide that ecosystem or support to women who feel not only that they are good enough, because most of the times when it comes to interviews, there's a lot of behavioral change when it comes to a woman doing an interview with a panel in comparison to a male, right? And if someone is judging you only on the basis of how you are speaking or presenting yourself and you're not good enough, and if you don't think you're good enough, I think that has really large impact on your own behavior. For instance, I remember Anisha Sharma had written this really cool paper, and she was one of the presenters in our events team and events. And she had basically done a very deep dive research on how econ as a profession is not really like when it comes to women, the representation is not that great, not only because the obvious reasons, right, but also because women don't see themselves. So even if they're doing good or well enough, they don't see themselves doing good. So I think it has to be like, of course, like it's an ecosystem and you provide that support, but I think a lot of things come from within, and we are, as an organization, trying to provide that through mentorship. Just to add to that, I think none of us mentioned that, but we do have a lot of focus on mentorship, and that's why we also set up a board of advisors, because we need mentoring as well to run an organization, and we wanted to keep it extremely diverse. So again, like for instance, we were speaking to one of our board of advisors who's from corporate, and we were telling her, you know, like how do you hire, um, and some of the traits that she saw, and she did highlight that she focuses and gives priority to female candidates. And the reason I'm mentioning this particular incident is when you need to make any institutional change, it needs to come from someone who's running that institution, right? You can't, okay, quota system works well enough, but you can't probably put these quotas or percentages in every organization. So I think it's something that people need to be sensitized, and then they can move on with it, like they can incorporate that and then they can work with that. So yeah, hoping to see more change.
Yeah,
Thank you so
I just
much, you
like,
guys. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Prerna. Yeah.
sorry, while we were on the topic of talking about other organizations, I thought I'll name some of them so that some, viewers can check out their work, because they do really good work as well. So there's Bahujan Economists, which is sort of creating like a space for SC, ST, OBC researchers in the field. There's Equity in Policy Education, which provides mentorship for students who want to apply for policy degrees. And there's also Purple Connect, which tries to basically match mentors and mentees from different fields, actually, not just economics, so the sciences and arts and so on, tries to connect mentors and mentees from Bahujan communities as well. So I think it's been really nice to see that over the last like 2 to 3 years, a lot of these organizations have come up. They've led to they've pushed a lot of organizations to have more conversations about diversity, and they've also like pushed, they've allowed for people to find a comfortable, inclusive space for themselves where they fit in.
Thank you for those names, Prerna. Actually, what we'll go ahead and do for everybody that's watching is we can add links to these organizations in the description or the show notes, so you guys can go check that out. And thank you guys for sharing and for being so candid, with the whole process of, the learning curve, and how a lot of times you yourself don't know what you're getting into when you start, and then it's like a surprise with, the support and also, the sort of course correction that you have to do. So thank you for being so candid about that. And I think this will be a great conversation for not just women aspiring to be in econ and policy, but also women who want to drive impact in this. So thank you so much. And we'll leave, for all of our viewers, we'll leave all the information regarding our guests, the organizations, and also Women in Econ and Policy, their newsletter that you can subscribe to, all in the description. So thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.